thank you to Malaprops for hosting our series, UNC Press Presents. And thank you all for being here this evening. I am Smithson Mills. I'm a lifetime supporter of the UNC Press and a proud North Carolinian. Did you know that in 2022, UNC Press celebrated 100 years of groundbreaking book publishing? UNC Press publishes about 125 books a year, or a new book every 3 days. Well over half of these books win awards each year. Awards such as the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize in History, and the Bancroft Prize. In an era of misinformation and debate over the nature of facts, university presses like UNC's provide meticulously researched, stringently peer-reviewed, and thoughtfully presented publications on a wide range of topics. UNC Press books represent the heart of university press publishing. Some are books written by leading scholars for use in the academy, and others are works of general interest, often beautifully illustrated. UNC Press's list includes books on history, environment, social issues, travel, music, art, foodways, guides to flora and fauna, and many, many other topics. UNC Press books address not only our state, but also the region, the nation, and a larger world. We have much to celebrate as the press begins its second century. No other institution does what UNC Press does for North Carolina. Through its numerous awards and reviews, the name of the press and the name of the university system are carried across the country and across the globe. We're very, very fortunate tonight to have an acclaimed author and scholar, Andrew McKevitt, who is going to be discussing his book, Gun Country, we've got Jake Charles, who was a colleague. First, I'm going to introduce Andrew. Andrew McKevitt is the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University. He is the author of Consuming Japan, Popular Culture and the Globalizing of 1980s America. I believe he will soon be known best as the author of Gun Country. After reading the fantastic review from the Washington Post that was published recently, I wanted to quote a nice paragraph that was there. The review says the book is sharp, fascinating, devastating, exhaustively researched, and often wryly funny. This indispensable book, one of the best works of nonfiction this year, details how America came to be not just a gun country, but the gun country, home to, quote, nearly half of all American, not all civilian-owned firearms in the world, and more than twice as many guns per person as any other nation. Joining Andrew tonight will be Jake Charles, an associate professor of law at the Pepperdine University Caruso School of Law, and an affiliated scholar with the Center for Firearms Law at Duke Law School. He writes and teaches on the Second Amendment and firearms law and is the co-author of a forthcoming law school textbook on the Second Amendment. Gentlemen, it's great to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to you for this evening's thrilling discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Smithson. It's great to be here. Even though I am a Duke alum and still affiliated with Duke, I'm happy to be here in this conversation about this great UNC Press book. I have probably been waiting on this book almost as long as Drew has been waiting for it to come out, because I have seen him tweeting about it for a very long time and very eagerly read it when I first got a hold of it recently. It's a terrific book. I can't agree enough with the Washington Post review. And so, Drew, I just wonder if, to start off, you can talk about how you got into guns as a consumer item and the importance of that in the story of the gun rights movement and the evolution of the Second Amendment. And then maybe relatedly, you can talk about if there was, or what maybe were the most surprising things that you unearthed during your research, especially things that you think were neglected by other historians.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jake, so much for being here. Like I said, it's very good to meet you virtually, finally. And thank you to Stephanie and Patricia and Smithson for the very generous introduction. So this book, I came about in a very roundabout way. So I am not a trained historian of guns. You probably know there aren't a lot of people who are trained specifically to be historians of guns. We're trained in many other things: political history, social history, economic history, and sometimes we find our ways to writing about guns. So I was actually trained as a historian of international relations, of U.S. foreign relations. And my first book, as Smithson mentioned, was about the United States relationship with Japan. And I was specifically interested in Americans in local settings consuming Japanese things, and how various products in the 1970s and the 1980s kind of changed local American local locales throughout the United States. And so when I got this job in Louisiana in 2012, I knew very little about the connections between the subject I was writing about then, Japan and the United States, and Louisiana. And so it began with something as simple as a Google search for like Louisiana and Japan. And I came across this case I had not known anything about, which was the 1992 shooting death of Yoshihiro Hattori, who was a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student who was shot to death in Baton Rouge in October of 1992 when he was looking for a Halloween party. Homeowner answered the door, saw an Asian teenager dressed up in a costume. First, the wife slams the door in his face, yells for her husband to go get the gun. And he runs to the closet, grabs a .44 Magnum Smith & Wesson, confronts Yoshi in the driveway, and shoots and kills Yoshi. And so this was something that interested me because there was an international angle to this, and I'm a historian of international relations. And so I was thinking, like, how come I didn't know this? This is Japan, the United States. It becomes an international incident because there's horror at the fact that a man can open his door armed with a handgun and shoot an unarmed teenager, and he's acquitted 8 months later of this crime under Louisiana's Castle Doctrine law, which allows you to use, if you're justifiably fearful, you can use lethal self-defense. And so there's the reaction in Japan is just complete shock and horror. And so this interests me at first. And there's another angle to the story too, which is that in the aftermath of Yoshi's killing, his parents in Japan and his host parents in the United States, they begin a gun control campaign. And it's a really fascinating one because unlike gun control campaigns that came earlier, it's sort of transnational. It's pointing Americans away from conversations about American exceptionalism and toward thinking about the global context of American gun violence. And this was not something I'd ever heard of before. And I thought maybe I'd write an article about it and see what happens. But, you know, as a historian, you always ask yourself, where did this thing come from? And you go back, and then you go back, and you keep going back and back and back. And so I went all the way back to 1945, trying to answer a bunch of questions about the global context of American gun ownership, of American gun violence. And, you know, so you asked about surprises. The thing that sort of struck me is just the pure numbers, right? And I begin the book with the pure numbers. As best we can tell, and you know, counting guns is a sort of mystical art in the United States because at least the federal government's not allowed to count guns. We have laws against counting guns, against gun registries. As best we could tell, in 1945, the end of World War II, there may have been about 45 million guns. This was an estimate of the first federal gun investigation in 1968 when Lyndon Johnson appoints a committee. Might have been about 45 million guns in 1945. Within a quarter century, that number doubles. Within another quarter century, that number doubles. And then once again, that number doubles to the point where we are at today, probably between 400 and 450 million guns, which is to say 10 times as many guns as there were in the United States in 1945. Just thinking in pure material terms, right? That's not even a judgment, a normative assessment of whether that's good or bad. 10 times as many guns as there were 75, 80 years ago, and only 2.5 times as many people. So we have this tremendous trajectory of the number of guns changing. And I don't think we ever had any good historical explanations for that, right? I mean, you know, as someone who studies the Second Amendment, we have explanations for why the United States is the gun country, and people point to the 18th century and say we're founded, the revolution is founded with fire, is firearms were essential to the revolution. Firearms were essential to the conquest of the continent, the spread across the continent in the 19th century, conflict with native peoples. But how do we explain that moment after 1945? I felt like there were no historical explanations for that, and I was driven to try and explain it. And that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you do really well is tell this different side of the development of the gun rights movement that is not just sort of an ideological tracing back to the founding generation, but that it was really cultivated both in response to these consumer changes, and then also you discuss how it changed in response to the development of a gun control movement at the same time. And that brings me to one question I want to ask you. And kind of throughout the book, you credit or blame, depending on your viewpoint, the gun control movement with a lot of what we see now as the hardline gun rights movement, the no compromise absolutist position on the Second Amendment. But at the same time, you trace this story of gun consumerism and gun capitalism and the influx of guns after the Second World War. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about how those two contributing factors relate to the development of a gun culture today that looks very different than the one that existed, say, in the 1940s or predating the 1940s.
Yeah, so you're pointing to one of the real tensions here in kind of the historical literature on guns, right? Like most of it is focused on the Second Amendment, so focused on questions of rights and more sort of abstract notions about who can own a gun and when they can purchase a gun and so on and so forth. And to me, that conversation was never sort of working in parallel to historical investigations of the material realities of guns. And that material reality includes all the various aspects we think of when we think about capitalism, right? The production, the marketing, distribution, the purchasing, the use of guns, and so on and so forth. They seem to be sort of parallel conversations. So one thing I wanted to try to do was to connect them here. And what I argue in the book is that the gun rights movement we think of so prominently, that we connect with the National Rifle Association or even so many other gun rights organizations that tend to be even further to the right of the National Rifle Association. When we think of those organizations, we often think that they're connecting to some sort of historical rights movement, that they themselves see their origins in 1791, or, more specifically with the NRA in 1871 in the aftermath of the Civil War. We were allegedly a nation of riflemen, and yet nobody seems to shoot well. And so this new organization is created with the idea of training American soldiers to shoot better. But we never have the conversation about how the post-war gun market helps to create that gun rights movement. And with it, working in tandem, the emergence of a gun control movement. So, to my mind, I think the assumption is that the traditional sort of assumption is that there was a gun country, there was demands for guns, there was always demand for guns, there was always supply for guns, there was a rights movement in tandem with that. And then at some point in the 1960s and the 1970s, we get a gun control movement emerging to try and go after that gun rights movement. When in reality, I think the story is sort of flipped. We begin with the market. The market is always there, and the market expands dramatically after the Second World War. And that is happening independent of any gun rights movement, because there is no gun rights movement to speak of in the 1950s, well until into the 1960s. And what comes before the gun rights movement is the gun control movement, because politicians especially, and the gun industry itself, prompt the first investigations at the federal level into investigating into the consumer gun market in the United States. And they're prompted to do that because of this dramatic expansion of the mass market for guns after the Second World War. And the thing that expands that mass market are, I argue, cheap imports. the imports flood in by the millions after the Second World War, and most of them are war surplus imports. So these are guns that were used on battlefields in Europe or in Asia, and there are American entrepreneurs over in Europe or in Asia sweeping into defense ministries and scooping up as many cheap firearms as they can, in some cases for as cheap as $1 each. And then they clean them up, they sporterize them, right? This is the moment when the modern sporting rifle is invented. We often use that term for the AR-15 today, but this is a post-World War II phenomenon. They sweep in and they clean up those firearms, they sporterize them, and then they start selling them to Americans, and they're super cheap. And what this does is it forces the gun industry to react. What do we do about these firearms that are selling for as cheap as $10 each, when our well-crafted hunting rifles are $100, $120, $150? Well, we don't want to compete. We're going to go to Congress. And we try to get our congressmen to act. And there's one wave of Congress's efforts in 1957 and 58 that doesn't quite go anywhere. And then it really begins in earnest in the early 1960s with a gun control movement led by a senator named Thomas Dodd. Now, all of this is happening, and Dodd looks into the imports, and Dodd starts talking about cheap handguns as well, which are also coming in incredible numbers. So much so that by 1968, 1 out of every 2 handguns sold in the United States is an import, a cheap import made out of cheap pot metal left over from the Second World War. And what happens in the 1960s is Dodd is making a lot of noise about investigating. And arguably, he's doing it at the behest of the traditional gun manufacturers. And this is the first real sort of national conversation about gun control we have after the Second World War. The 1930s, we have a wave of gun controlling as well. But it's driven by that dramatic expansion of the gun market. Then the gun control movement sort of arrives. And what that prompts is gun rights organizing. So the gun rights organizing actually comes last. As much as we sort of connect like the gun country to 1791, to the Second Amendment, there is no mass movement to protect gun rights in the United States until the 1960s, until the gun control movement creates it. And that, as I write about in one chapter in this book, that prompts organizing at the local level, especially among what we would today call, or at the time, they even referred to themselves as right-wing conservatives. These are people associated with organizations like the John Birch Society and other sort of right-wing groups who are actively, aggressively organizing for gun rights. And these are the first people, the gun rights groups, that start talking about the Second Amendment. And they're the ones who are going to push the Second Amendment, especially this kind of absolutist Second Amendment, upward to the National Rifle Association, to these groups that are reaching millions of people. And so to me, it was fascinating to see that dynamic play out when we assume like the NRA is there since the 19th century, it's always protected gun rights, when in reality, the gun rights conversation comes after the gun control conversation.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, the story that you tell about Sam Cummings and his importation business. I mean, I had never personally heard of him before. I haven't read about him and histories of what the gun rights movement looks like or the legislative responses. And it seems like he really had a key role to play, and people of his kind that were importing these guns by the millions really had a key role to play in the development of this need for a legislative response, and then the gun control movement and the response among gun rights activists. You write at one point, kind of related to this idea that not understanding guns as a object of consumer desire has led to a distortion, and especially I think you talk about in some of the public health literature that just pathologizes guns. And I wonder if you could say more about what do you think the perspective misses that's only talking about guns as a pathological response to, say, fear or insecurity, that misses this consumer angle?
Yeah, and there's a line you got to walk here, because I am fully sympathetic to the fact that the material reality of what are 50,000 people a year killed with firearms, 100,000 or more injured. Those are real lives, and they are really affected. But when we think about the material reality of guns in the United States, we're talking about 400 million guns, 450 million guns, and a few 100,000 violent incidents, which is to say just a tiny fraction of the guns in the United States being used each year in some sort of violent incident. And so, again, the public health literature is crucial and essential to trying to solve that problem of 45, 50,000 gun deaths a year, on top of the ways that the threat of gun violence in certain communities has ramifications beyond the simple harming of human bodies. That is an essential perspective on this problem. And this is a problem, right? I mean, I think there's some people who would say it's not a problem. That's the consequence of living in a free society. But on the other hand, I think if we want to understand, especially the dramatic expansion of gun ownership since 1945, and the rapid expansion of the marketing and selling of guns, we have to understand why people buy guns. And fear is one reason why people buy guns. There's no doubt about it, right? Even the NRA themselves openly admits this, at least through the 1970s, right? There's a part of one chapter in there is about this figure, Harlan Carter. So Harlan Carter is one of the people who reinvents the NRA in the 1970s. And he comes out of these radical communities of the 1960s that are adopting this more absolutist approach to the Second Amendment and using the Second Amendment as the justification for gun rights and the thing that needs to be defended. And Harlan Carter himself comes right out and says, you know, you're not fooling anyone. People are rushing into gun stores. He says this in 1975, which is, you know, the peak of post-war gun violence. People are rushing into gun stores because they're afraid, because they see horrific things happening on television, and they're going to the gun store. And the very next day, the gun store owner will tell you, I sell more guns the day after some horrific thing is on the nightly news. So there's no question that fear is one thing that drives gun sales. But I'm also, as a historian of consumerism, I'm interested in not just the ways in which consumers are manipulated. And I think, you know, an organization like the NRA or gun manufacturers can attempt to manipulate consumers by trying to pitch fear and other things that drive these kind of base emotions. But on the other hand, I'm also interested in how people see the things they buy as changing who they are and making them a better person, right? I mean, every purchase is aspirational. I have a house full of books I'll probably never read, but I aspire to be a better person who's read all of those books, right? We buy exercise bikes because we aspire to be something better than what we are. And so every purchase we make is, in a sense, beyond the sort of bare necessities, but every sort of luxury purchase we make, every time we spend hundreds of dollars on something, we are saying something about who we want to be. And I wanted to take that more sympathetic approach to understanding gun buyers in the post-war era. Of course, it's hard to do that in the context of the post-war era when you see so many spikes in gun ownership in the 1960s and through the 1970s, then in the 1990s, and of course in the last 2 decades, following a trajectory of fear and anxiety, right? I mean, that's when we see the real spikes in gun ownership. But at the same time, the 99% of people who purchase guns do not use those guns in an act of violence or in a crime or anything like it. And so how do people see themselves when they buy guns? And to me, thinking about the post-war era, this is, talking about Sam Cummings bringing in these guns and pitching, marketing this vast cornucopia of the world's firearms to American consumers. This is people seeing themselves at the top of a kind of global pecking order now. We won the war, we get the guns. Is what Samuel Cummings markets to people. You get the guns for having sacrificed and won the war. This is part of the peace dividend. And so in some ways, I think that marketing in the aftermath of the Second World War and the consumer desire we see as a consequence of it is it's more aspirational. It is as much as it is driven by fear, and the two mix. And right, even I don't think a social science could measure these sort of things. We're talking about emotions and we're talking about subjectivity. But I think, seeing those two things working in tandem rather than just seeing gun owners as people who've been manipulated and scared into doing what they do, I think is a more sort of nuanced and empathetic approach to, lots of people who are not criminals, who have not committed crimes, who see themselves as good people.
Yeah, I think a lot of your Twitter followers might be pleased to hear you say that. So you have a really fascinating chapter called "The Cold War's Second Amendment," and it gets into the role that this particular point in time plays in the development of this culture. So not just the flood of the cheap firearms, but you talk about anti-communism and the Vietnam War and the role of the civil rights movement and racial unrest. And I'm wondering if you can just tell a little bit about that story of the development of the Cold War Second Amendment and how that relates to the modern day Second Amendment movement and gun rights movement more broadly.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things we miss when we talk about the gun rights movement today, when we talk about how it's sort of radical and extreme and it's committed to this hardline absolutist defense of the Second Amendment, all of which is true. But I wanted to know where that came from, right? When did the gun rights organizations or the gun rights activists first start talking that way, and what shaped them into talking that way? Because people weren't talking like that in the 19th century about gun. I mean, if I'm sure you could find somebody out there who wrote something like it, but you didn't have a mass movement of people talking about gun rights in that particular way. That emerges in the 1960s. And it emerges out of a cauldron of social and political upheaval that, all gets wrapped into this phrase of the 60s, right? Whether it be the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and then eventually we have the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement. All of these things get kind of wrapped up in this package of the 60s. And these are, again, self-identified right-wing conservatives who are watching, to their mind, the world collapse, right? In 1945, the world was ours. We were at the top of the pecking order. And here we are 25 years later. It seems like internally, the social order is collapsing. Externally, the international order is collapsing with American humiliation in Vietnam, with the rise of communist China, with competition from the Soviet Union, with communist insurgencies breaking out all over the place. And so it's impossible to understand the ideas that emerge out of the gun rights movement when the gun rights movement first coalesces in the 1960s without understanding the world as they see it at that particular moment, right? And for them, it's they're still living in kind of McCarthyist times. McCarthy was right for many of these people, right? McCarthy is humiliated on national television and becomes sort of a laughingstock for many sort of centrists and liberals after 1953, 1954. But for right-wing conservatives, McCarthy was right. McCarthy knew what he was talking about. Barry Goldwater, running for president in 1964, is speaking their language. This is where we first hear the kind of language about law and order that Richard Nixon will really pick up on. Barry Goldwater was even running advertisements showing social chaos in the streets and violence and crime. When most Americans aren't even paying attention to these things, arguably Barry Goldwater kind of invents this that eventually will emerge in 1968. And so the gun rights movement they're listening to these people. They're listening to the John Birchers, who are obsessed with anti-communism, the very people who accuse Dwight Eisenhower of being a communist, of top U.S. generals being a communist. These are the people who the early gun rights movement are listening to and they're identifying with. And so anti-communism is already a kind of paranoid obsession for them. And then what's happening in the 1960s with the various social upheavals, particularly the sort of Black uprisings in places like we have Harlem in 1964, Watts in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 1967. After King's killing in April of 1968, we have uprisings breaking out in 100 or more cities across the United States. The gun rights movement, or the early gun rights movement, the people who will be organizing by 1967 and 1968, after years of gun control pressure in Congress, they're reading that as communist inspired. This is Maoism, Leninism, Marxism coming home to roost. These civil rights protesters are all communists, right? I mean, this is the same. I mean, even the FBI is investigating Martin Luther King and making all kinds of insinuations about his connections to the communist movement. But particularly when Black people take to the streets in the 1960s and start violently protesting against police brutality, against lack of economic opportunity, when they're taking that rage out on the streets, the gun rights movement is reading this as this is communist inspired. The revolution is coming home. We need our guns to defend ourselves from this insurgency, essentially a communist insurgency come to America's streets. And so I write about, for instance, in chapter 3, Detroit, in the wake of the uprising in Detroit in 1967, a man named Donald Lobsinger, who is he is organizing much earlier than 1967, years before. He is running an organization called Breakthrough. Breakthrough is committed to anti-communism. They think the John Birch Society doesn't go far enough. The Birchers are all talk, according to Donald Lobsinger, and he wants some action. So he's out even as early as 1965. He's going to college campuses and counter-protesting anti-war protesters. And 1967 is, for an organization called Breakthrough, his breakthrough moment, because we have the uprising in Detroit, 40 plus some odd people killed, the white suburbs surrounding Detroit panicking, lots of anxiety, lots of gun buying. And he's going and essentially hosting large gatherings and rallies, essentially, with thousands of people showing up to hear him talk about how this is the product of the communist conspiracy finally coming home to roost. And we have to arm ourselves in order to be prepared. And so they're giving out instructions essentially on how to arm your neighborhood, on how to arm your block, how to get cheap guns, especially quality weapons that are made for war. These are not cheap rifles that you'd buy for a kid to go out and shoot a squirrel for the first time. These are guns that are war surplus, that were used in Europe, that are made for killing effectively. And that bounty is out there for you. Go down to the gun store, get yourself a rifle that was made for war, and get ready to go to war. And so that without understanding that context, I don't understand how we can understand the Second Amendment movement or the gun rights movement today, because you still see that kind of paranoia reflected in it, that kind of absolutism, that this is where we draw the line. The language hinting at violence and hinting at insurrection, even against one's own government. Mm-hmm. All of that comes out of that crucible of the 1960s. And we just don't talk about it today when we talk about the gun rights movement, because it's so, we're 50, 60 years out, and they've kept the language and they've kept the rhetoric, though they've ditched mostly, for the most part, ditched the anti-communism, ditched the Cold War stuff.
Yeah. And one of the things when talking about the development of this, you talk about some of the United Nations early efforts around firearms restrictions. And you tell this really poignant story at the beginning of the book that you told here a little bit about Yoshi Hattori and his murder, or his killing, I guess I should say, in Louisiana. And you come back to that at the end of the book, and the way that his family, both in Japan and his host family in the United States, kind of mobilized and tried to mobilize the international community in favor of more restrictive gun policies. So can you talk about how are these kind of international comparisons relevant? There is a lot in the book about how domestic gun control groups would often point to other countries and say the United States is kind of unique in the sense of having this many weapons and suffering this much gun violence, and having so few policies surrounding gun use. And yet there is this real opposition to international examples because of this American exceptionalism. So can you talk about both that movement and how you traced it within the book, and then what relevance do those kind of international comparisons hold today?
Yeah, this is where sort of the rubber hits the road when thinking about, the reality of guns in the United States and what policies the United States can adopt, right? And so it's never been a mystery how you stop gun violence. You get rid of the guns, right? I mean, you can't have gun. It's just a logical thing. You can't have gun violence if there are no guns. ... But we're in a situation in which there are 400 million guns and they're not going anywhere, right? And so we need to think about this is, the gun control movement has evolved into the gun safety movement, which I think some people see as sort of a retreat in the sense that it's understanding gun control is not the kind of control is not sort of language Americans like to hear, right? We don't like to think of ourselves as being controlled. So gun safety is a sort of strategic retreat, but it's also premised on the idea that the guns aren't going anywhere, right? And so we can't control the guns. How do we then keep ourselves safe from the guns? And so activists going back to the 1960s were already making these international comparisons. The first really important book on American gun violence and the American gun problem in the United States comes in 1966. It's written by a journalist named Carl Bacall. Bacall himself, he was a World War II vet. He had been in the occupation of Japan and Germany. And he comes back, he's writing about different subjects as a journalist, but he's just struck by how often he's opening the newspaper and seeing just these sort of horrific, almost sort of novel ways in which people die because guns are everywhere, right? I mean, he's talking about like two teenage girls fighting over a magazine about Elvis. Like one grabs her father's handgun and shoots her friend. He's like, this kind of horrific thing doesn't happen in other countries. And so this idea of putting this American gun violence in context is crucial to the early gun rights movement, the gun control movement. In 1968, Johnson, in the aftermath of King's killing, in the aftermath of Bobby Kennedy's killing in June of 1968, Lyndon Johnson appoints a presidential commission. And that commission is tasked with investigating American violence across history and across time and space, and trying to explain American violence in this moment where it feels like American society is really violent. And they appoint a firearms task force that is the first time the federal government is doing anything to investigate gun history, gun violence, gun ownership in the United States. And one of the things they set out to do is try to understand America's gun policies and the consequences of it in a global context. So what they do is the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, writes to every U.S. embassy around the world and says, we want to know what the gun policies are like in your countries. How many guns are there? What are the restrictions on those guns? How many gun deaths and so on and so forth are tallied up. And it's remarkable. And all of the replies, all of the telegrams are in the Johnson Library in Austin. It's such a treasure trove of this moment when Americans are trying to figure themselves out in the world and their gun problem. It's just amazing how many people write back and say, well, there are very few guns here, and there are a lot of restrictions on guns. And the government doesn't even have data on gun deaths because they're just, they have data on murders or homicides or whatever, but they don't sort them out by guns because guns are rarely used in these instances. And these societies don't think of guns as a problem. And that's not just like we would expect it in France and Great Britain and West Germany and sort of quote unquote the developed world. There are lots of third world countries in the 1960s reporting the same thing. And so it's this shocking moment for these investigators to look around the world and say, this really is an American thing. This is very rare to see anywhere else in the world, especially outside of places that are not in some sort of civil war. And so they conceive of what's going on in the United States as a kind of war zone, because it's the only metaphor they have for understanding a society where thousands of people are shot to death a year. And so this trajectory begins in the 1960s. This is the stuff when I set out to write this book, when I first discovered the Yoshi story and his parents and his host parents trying to understand things in an international context, using the Japan example, for instance. So, I think maybe 3-4 years ago, Japan had fewer than 10 gun deaths in an entire year compared to 40,000 plus in the United States, right? And so they're pointing to Japan and they're saying that's the model, a society where guns are so intensely restricted that there are fewer than 1 million in Japan in a population of 130 million people, that if you own a gun, it's got to be registered, you are licensed, it is taxed regularly. You, for the most part, you can't even keep the gun in your home. You have to keep it in a locker at a police station. You have to sign it out if you're going hunting or sport shooting or something like that. That is pointing the way for us to think about the problems we have and think about how we are standing out so exceptionally in the world. Here is a civilized society on the other side of the world that is showing us how to do it better. And, you know, the host family, they know that this is, in a sense, a kind of naive message in a country which at that point had 200 million guns or something like that. And Yoshi's parents, they're organizing over in Japan. They get almost 2 million signatures, right? This is in a country of 120, 130 million people. They get 2 million signatures in Japan, and they present them to Bill Clinton a week before what would have been Yoshi's 18th birthday, which also was the 30th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and which was also, I learned recently, this birthday of Eugene Stoner, the creator of the AR-15. Kind of remarkable, all these intersections. But they're making the case that the United States has to build a gun-free society, and here's why. Because look at the rest of the world, and these things don't happen anywhere else in the quote-unquote civilized world or outside of conflict zones. And, you know, it's just a message that falls flat after 25 years after the Gun Control Act, after that intense moment of trying to figure out what's going on in the 1960s, the creation of the gun rights movement, then in the aftermath, grassroots gun control movements forming. The sides have just calcified by the early 1990s, and they're not going to get any movement on it. And so, you know, this thing that I thought was like, oh, here's this fascinating story about them trying to make these international connections in this moment. What kind of impact did they have? What were they trying to do? And, you know, going back to 1945, eventually I realized, like, they're stuck there in the 1990s. And they just have, they're trying to smash against every wall, and there's just nowhere for them to go. They're already sort of encased in what was already beginning to solidify in the late 1960s.
Well, I could keep asking you questions forever on this topic, but let me call Patricia in to see if there are questions from the audience so that we can get to some of those if we have time for that.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic overview and conversation. We appreciate your time, Drew and Jacob. As the audience is bringing in questions, let me just ask you a writing process question, Drew. How do you get these books done? What's your strategy? And what have you learned over time works best for you?
Oh gosh, you know, the thing that was, I teach a lot here at Louisiana Tech, right? It's a great school, but we don't have many historians, and everyone's got to take history classes. So, you know, there are years in which I teach 11 classes a year. So the thing that really, you know, how do I get it done? I got it done because I got lucky and I got a big grant to write this project from the Louisiana Board of Regents, which was just essential to getting this done. I had a year off, a few years, 2019, 2020, going into the pandemic, of course. And that was just essential to have the time every single day to sit down with documents, to think through these things. And you can't think about these big questions without that. And you know, I've struggled with it myself. Like, is it? I know there's like people, good writers, right? Not me, but like good writers tell you it's about discipline. You've got to, you know, you got to think about it not like an artist, but like a craftsperson, right? Like you just sit down and you build a bookshelf every day, and eventually it'll add up to what you're looking for. But I struggle with it myself, trying to force myself to sit down and write 30 minutes a day or write 60 minutes a day. And, you know, unfortunately, I think it's just, you got to buy yourself some time to sit down and think about big issues.
Right. What about you, Jacob? Do you have any tried and true strategies for getting the writing done? No.
I struggle with it just as much as Drew does. I need big chunks of time to do it, so I'm not one who's really good at sitting down for 30 minutes and 60 minutes to write, which often means that some weeks I just don't get much writing done at all. But I try to set aside like 3 or 4 hours to get myself in the headspace to do writing. And so if I can find that kind of time in a week, then I can be really productive.
Well, that's a nice comparison between the two of you. Drew, let's talk about a question regarding what is capitalism? Let's do a big question. I think that you've grounded this very skillfully in the history of the Cold War and the economic systems. So if you had to explain, like, what kind of capitalism are you talking about, assuming my premise is correct that there's different kinds and it changes over time. What's the economic system you're talking about here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, it's sort of forcing the historian to define his terms. And so, something like gun capitalism exists at least back to the middle of the 19th century, right? It's not invented after the Second World War. It is created by people like Samuel Colt, Oliver Winchester, this first generation of great gun capitalists. And for them, it was a combination of the mass production of firearms, which they sort of perfect and they figure out, alongside the creation of markets for those firearms, the creation of demand. We often think about, again, like I think there's just sort of an assumption that in the United States, there's always been a supply of guns and there's always been demand for guns. And it's because we've always been a gun country. But people like Samuel Colt and Oliver Winchester worked hard to create that demand in the 19th century. And they weren't always very good at it. Colt they're great storytellers. Colt is, there's the famous line, God made man and Samuel Colt made man equal, or something like that. But that's a marketing pitch. All that marketing is necessary because they're really trying to create markets for people to buy guns in the 19th century. And it's really up and down. A lot of gun makers go out of business in the 19th century because it's hard selling to a consumer market or trying to create consumer markets in a country that is not quite yet a mass consuming population. And so, the Civil War is a huge boom for them. But then a lot of them go bust after the Civil War because there's so many cheap guns now floating around as a consequence of the Civil War. And so to my mind, what happens after the end of the Second World War is the change in the way we tell the story of gun capitalism, or at least the way that the gun capitalists talk about the story of guns in America. It's no longer about sort of the conquest of the West or the revolutionary generation, or how often traditional firearms manufacturers would advertise with images of fathers and sons going out hunting together for the first time, or they'd emphasize the craftsmanship of the rifle, many of which are just beautifully made, and if well preserved, they'd last forever. Instead, after the Second World War, it becomes about plenty. It becomes about the bounty of firearms. If you look at the advertisements, how they change when that first generation after the Second World War, the Sam Cummings, as Jake mentioned, the Samuel Cummings, who has this company called Interarms, and he's really, I think, the chief innovator here after the Second World War. He's not advertising the craftsmanship of the rifle or drawing on American traditions or heritage. He is packing as many guns as he can into a single page because he wants you to think of guns in America now as an unlimited bounty. Buy, buy, buy. That is the message of gun capitalism after the Second World War, in contrast to earlier generations where it was about telling stories about the connections between guns in the United States. If there's any story after the Second World War, it's we won and we get all the guns. And because nobody else around the rest of the world has the market to dump off all of these guns, that really, I think, changes gun capitalism after the Second World War, where it really becomes about a mass consumer culture and bringing as many people in as possible. And that's Samuel Cummings' argument when Congress does eventually come knocking on his door. He says, these gun makers have got it all wrong. They think I'm stealing their business when, in fact, I am expanding their business. I'm bringing millions of people into gun ownership who never would have been able to afford guns before, or who wouldn't have taken the step to buy a $150 gun. And rather, they'd like to buy a $10 gun to see if they like it. And if they do, then they'll come buy your $150 gun. I'm creating consumer markets. And in that ways, Samuel Cummings is he belongs in that pantheon with Samuel Colt and Oliver Winchester of kind of the great gun capitalists in American history.
We've got a couple of questions also. This one from Kirk. What suggestions do you have that might help us move into a healthier dialogue?
Yeah, wow. I mean, we have a very unhealthy. I know every time I tweet something that I can tell you the dialogue is not terribly helpful. I think we need to move away from the stigmatization of guns and gun owners and bring them into conversation. While it is undoubtedly true that there are radical and extreme positions, I think those radical and extreme, the people expressing those positions exploit people who would otherwise not agree with those radical and extreme positions, but to sort of bring them to their side, when in reality, we know there is a vast middle in there of people who own guns, who want to protect gun rights, but who are also horrified at 45,000 deaths a year, at mass shootings, and who actively support firearms restrictions. I mean, I know it from my own students, right? I'm in a very conservative area here in North Louisiana. It is a sea of red in North Louisiana with a couple of blue spots. And I teach a gun history class at Louisiana Tech every 2 or 3 years. And what's always striking to me is that the students overwhelmingly identify as gun rights supporters, but also they're perfectly on board with the various gun control proposals we often see, whether it's red flag laws or universal background checks. Many of them even believe you should have to take a training course on firearm safety in order to and be licensed to carry a firearm. And that's here in rural North Louisiana, where so many people are hunters and they own lots of firearms. And so I think the radical and extreme voices are a minority, and they drown out a reasonable majority, a kind of silent majority of gun owners and people who would be willing to have real conversations with those gun owners. But in this media environment where the loudest voices on Twitter often have their say, I don't know how we break through that. But there is a middle out there, and I don't know how we bring those middle voices into the at the top of the conversation, so we hear them more than we hear the radical and extreme voices.
Well, it's interesting that how are you going to market the middle, right? How are you going to create the demand for that middle ground, to use a little bit of your own language, and being on Twitter, now known as X? What's it like being, I'm putting dialogue in air quotes here to follow up with, to have a follow-up question. What's that experience like? It seems like you're pretty brave to be active on that platform.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I'm from New Jersey. Nothing bothers me. I think I have a tough skin when it comes to insults and the trolling you get on online platforms from these kinds of things. And so yeah, I mean, again, it's a place. Twitter or any social media is a place where the loudest and most radical voices get elevated, and then they are able to amplify their radical message, right? I mean, there's very few kind of moderate voices that are able to direct these conversations. And so I don't know. I mean, I've struggled with it. I have struggled with it. You very rarely come across, you're more likely to get sort of angry trolls yelling at you online than people who want to have any kind of sincere conversation, which is just so weird, because that's not what real life is like, right? It's such a weird inversion of real life. When I walk in a classroom and talk to my students, who overwhelmingly identify as conservative, many of whom, 90% of them, are gun owners, and many of whom, 95% of them, are support gun rights, it's very easy for us to have a conversation as like reasonable, rational people. And yet, one thing gets retweeted on Twitter and reaches a certain segment of the Twitter population, and then you just have to turn off your notifications because you just don't want to read any of that stuff. It's such a weird inversion of reality. And I don't know how to escape it. I don't know how we have real conversations with real people rather than letting this kind of radical echo chamber dominate the conversation. Jake, do you have any?
Not to chime in defense of Twitter, but I mean, we connected over Twitter, and so I think there is a space for people of goodwill to search out and find other people who are experienced and educated in a certain area of history or law or policy, and actually learn from them. So I learn tons of things from people I follow on Twitter. And so I think there is room for social media to serve that role. Twitter is becoming less like that these days, but I think there is a role for that.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that reminder of the value of it. And in some ways it's kind of it's a bit of a bummer that it's gone in the direction it's gone, because here being in North Louisiana, which is a pretty remote place from academic centers around the world. I mean, I've met, I would never know Jake if not for Twitter, and hundreds of people like Jake who are engaged in similar kinds of research. And we've built networks to have these kinds of conversations over the years. And, see, that was the very point, right? Like the radicals, the loud voices, they drowned out Jake, and They drowned out all the good people who you do meet on Twitter who can have these conversations. And I hope, I don't know, I hope it rebounds, or we get some sort of equivalent replacement, because it is a good and important place, or at least it was at a time.
And it helps market books too.
That's right. That's right.
Fair point. So we're at the top of the hour, and I'd like to fold in a question from Elizabeth Kostova, kind of a whither guns and gun ownership and gun politics a decade from now, because of course anybody who's a historian, we're very careful about making predictions. There's that crystal ball is seductive but dangerous. So if you want to kind of talk about hypothetical, but then also grounded in reality, what's next for you as we wrap up?
Yeah, so I'll defer again to history here, right? I am the historian, and I don't want to try to imagine the future, but I can go back to the past, to 1968, to that commission that Lyndon Johnson appointed, and their conclusions. Their conclusions were there are too many guns in the United States. This was 1968, and they said there's probably about 90 million guns in the United States, and that's too many. Particular, they were focused on handguns, the 25 million handguns in the United States at that moment, which accounted for, and still account for, anywhere from 70 to 80% of gun deaths in the United States annually. Their conclusion 55 years ago was get rid of them. You have to get rid of them. It would be the most dramatic instance of property confiscation, perhaps in the history of any liberal democracy, but it's the only way you can control the violence and stop the violence, particularly this interpersonal violence and social violence and so forth. And if you don't do that, in 25 years, you're going to have 200 million guns. And in another 25 years, you'll have 400 million guns. And in another 25 years, will we have 800 million guns, 900 million guns? I don't know, but that's the trajectory. And that trajectory has been pretty solid for the last 60 years. So we need to do something. I don't know what that thing is. I can't offer a prescription, but we have to do something to break that cycle. And, maybe thinking about capitalism some more, the producers, the marketers. And we've had a little bit of success in that regard. The Remington case, where Remington was sued and lost $73 million by the Sandy Hook parents because of their marketing, essentially. Maybe that's a place to look in the future. Rather than stigmatizing gun owners and gun ownership, go after the market, go after the capitalists. And maybe that's the place to start. Jake, I don't know if you have any more less pessimistic or cynical conclusions than that.
No, I think that was one of my questions I was going to ask you about, going after the market too. So I think that makes sense.
And for the two of you, starting with Drew, are you working on something else now, or is that hush hush?
Oh, I'm just looking to take a nap. I just want to think about it. No, I have a new project in mind about the violence in 1967 and 68 and how white populations responded to that and organized in almost sort of paramilitary ways to against Black uprisings. I think we've had a lot of really good work recently about those Black uprisings and centering Black actors, and I think in some ways we've kind of let white people off the hook because there was a lot of I have some really good anecdotes about some stories from 67 and 68 when there were a lot of people getting ready for war, and I'd like to tell that story. I think a kind of social history.
And Jacob, what about you? What's next for you?
I'm still following what the Supreme Court's doing with respect to the Second Amendment. It's interesting because the Supreme Court has mandated a new historical test for Second Amendment claims, and yet it's not listening to many of the voices like Drew, who are actual historians who study these issues. So it's still listening to the lawyers for some reason. So I'm trying to keep up with what the Supreme Court's doing, working on a case book on the Second Amendment that kind of analyzes how court doctrine's going.
Well, it's been a pleasure to listen to this conversation. Drew, I want to congratulate you on this latest success. And Smithson was right earlier. That was a great review from the Washington Post. Drew's latest book is Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America. It was a pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to you both coming back again.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Jake. Thank you to everyone at Malaprops. This was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, audience. Have a lovely evening.